Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and this episode we're going to be doing something that's a little less theoretical and a little more practical. We're going to be looking at the automatic expansion, and we're going to be providing various strategies for automatic expansion that will give you a relatively good-looking economy, with the idea that this is a concession towards, perfect play, but it will give you a relatively good-looking economy and will kind of be overall pretty good in the long term. For this, we are going to be first talking about the various features that go into evaluating where we should auto-expand. Then we're going to provide some typical states, or typical types of states in which you will see a lot and understand how and what you want to build in these states. And finally, we are going to be going through each good, especially those that we didn't mention, and talk about where, if at all, we do want to auto-expand these things, and just kind of doing this as a sort of quick rundown through these to give an idea what are the type of states that you want to be auto-expanding in. The first and most important aspect of where you want to auto-expand is going to have to do with market access price impact, or MAPI. This is the most important because it's going to affect the real prices that goods get paid at locally, and you generally want to have vertically integrated economies. One very important thing to discuss with MAPI is that you will be getting minus 10% from an unincorporated state. So generally speaking, you are going to prefer not to place manufactories in unincorporated states. This will be layered, kind of in an exacerbated way if you happen to go onto being a colonial exploitation, because there will be an additional penalty for manufacturing industries throughput in unincorporated states. That's the first MAPI consideration. The second MAPI consideration is going to be, generally speaking, you're going to build around the resources that are available in the state or the lack thereof. The next consideration that's going to be particularly important is depeasanting is a really important way of creating value in your economy, because moving from someone from a subsistence farm into a real job is going to give you more value than moving them from one job to another. So you're generally not going to want to auto-expand too aggressively in places with no peasants, and more aggressively in places with peasants, although this will probably be mostly active expansion, but there are going to be a couple industries in particular that you just always blast auto expansion on if they have peasants, or even worse, if they have unemployed pops. The next sort of consideration that's going to be important is going to be throughput. Very often you will want to push throughput for various reasons, especially with the agriculture. You want your throughput strategy to be quite strong because you very often can't get max throughput bonuses. And finally, the last thing that we'll be considering is some industries are just too good or too bad to really want them to auto expand, and this will affect it. The efficacy of the PM is going to inform whether or not we ever want to auto expand a thing. And so we will talk a little bit about these. A good example is livestock ranches. You really don't want to auto-expand very aggressively at all because they're really bad. And so that will be the final sort of consideration when it comes to evaluating where and what we should be auto-expanding. So we won't talk too much about this type of state, but I did want to mention that rainbow states, when they have every type of mineral, generally speaking, you can build everything in. However, since you can build everything here, it's generally better to prioritize building the types of things that you don't want to build in other places. And so it's generally going to be stuff that has a lot of inputs of these minerals, and you'll focus a lot less on something like clothing, which doesn't have any mineral inputs except for the tools, which you would build in a place where you have mining, because tools are a big part of the input of the mining, but you can pull back on clothes because clothes have a lot of other inputs, and they can often be something that you would want to build elsewhere. The second state we're going to talk about is going to be construction states in general, with the prototypical or best example being a state that has both iron and coal in a healthy amount, with an emphasis on the iron. However, any state that has a lot of iron plus one other mineral will also be reasonable. The reason for this is because early on, iron and coal are really, really good because coal is an input in most of the PMs that you utilize for, the mineral of iron, and iron is the biggest input for construction. So you build construction in these places, and then you're going to want the goods that go into construction. Initially, it's iron frame buildings, which are a tremendous amount of iron, and then steel frame buildings, which are still going to involve a lot of iron because more iron is used in steel than in coal, and so if you're not going to have one of them, it's better to not have the coal than the iron in terms of building tall. And so in these places, where again you could have iron plus any X. You are generally going to want to put an auto expand on tooling because it goes into the mines and the mines go into it in terms of either the steel tools or the iron tools earlier. You are going to want to put an auto expand on steel, and then you are also going to want to put an auto expand, generally speaking, on engines. Engines and steel tend to not have very good PMs, and so having all of these condensed, especially early on, especially this is where you're constructing, can be very helpful. To a lesser extent, Glassworks is going to be a decent auto expand, especially if your secondary resource is lead. It's a must if your secondary resource is lead. And explosives is going to be a decent auto expand. You'll generally want to include it, but you especially will guaranteed want to be including it if you are having iron plus sulfur. And so the first one we are going to think about is we are building our construction out from these places. Putting auto expands in these areas will be very, very strong. And so we will also want to keep an eye on the population, especially having a sensitivity towards peasants. If there aren't a lot of peasants, you'll want to pull off the auto expansions of other stuff. And then finally, just to be clear, the auto expansions on minerals in general will always be good. If you always auto expand minerals, it will sometimes be a mistake, but it won't be too big a mistake because the mineral resources are always good, or very nearly always good, and so this was a fine way to approach the game if you want to have a more hands-off, type of way of going about things. Next up, we want to talk about sulfur states specifically, especially states that only have sulfur. These will have a lot of really good auto expands because a lot of stuff builds out of sulfur in particular. A really good example of one of these states, or the best example, is Sicily, which only has sulfur, although to be fair, it has silk and cotton as well, which we'll get to in a second. But sulfur is a really, really important industry because it has one of the very best PMs in the game. However, there's generally not a lot of market demand for sulfur, and so it's hard to really build a ton of it. However, you can increase local demand for sulfur building various things, and those things are going to be fertilizer, which is one of the more critical ones. It's going to be nice when you have sulfur and iron together anytime you're doing this, and especially if you have a grain that you want to be auto expanding as well, it will pair nicely. You don't want to build grain in Sicily specifically. This will further build into the explosives industry, and it will also, the sulfur at least, will build into the paper industry, which you notice also has an input for dyes, which is good because fertilizer is also an input along with sulfur for dyes. And so sulfur really has very strong vertical integration. And so for the most part, you want to have every single place that has paper, except for maybe the capital, because you're creating a lot of buy orders in the capital for paper. You want most of your places that have paper to be sulfur places. You want most of your, places that have fertilizer to be sulfur places. And so you will want to have this all be vertically integrated. Probably the only place I'd ever build synthetics plants is where there are sulfur, generally speaking, as well. And then explosives you will often want to have in various other places. Besides sulfur places, but they are going to be the best in sulfur places. They used to take in iron and coal. They don't anymore. They are still you're going to want to build them in those places from an input perspective, but also just from, in terms of they are inputs for the mines, and so it will have a high price, and so it'll be more profitable, but they will be extra profitable, in particular in the areas you have sulfur. And if you can create more demand for sulfur in your market, this will be generally a good thing, because sulfur, if the price of it is ever high, is going to be one of the very best buildings you can build on kind of any basis. And so sulfur ones are important to keep in mind. Now, if you are building synthetic plants in an area, and it happens to be an area, you happen to not be a country that has a lot of dyes that you can build, like let's say Italy, it might also be one of the better places for you to build textiles, because you will be getting dyes input here. The mines and tools are not terrible to build in a place where you have plenty of demand for them. Tools is one of the more flexible places you can build. And so if you are able to create either silk or fabric alongside your dyes, then it will be reasonable to also put textiles in with that. And so that is a sort of integration that you might want to keep in mind, in particular for the sulfur. Now, the textiles bring us to a kind of rare type of place, which is a place that has all the inputs for fabric or textiles, with the exception of one. And by that, I mean rubber is also an input. We don't see it here in Delhi. I don't think there's a single state in the game that also has rubber, in addition to having cotton plantations, dye plantations, and silk plantations. However, this state is very important, as is the Bengal states, because it has silk, cotton, dyes, and over 153 arable land. The reason why this is critically important is because if you have over 153, you can get to max economies of scale in all of these buildings. And this is normally something that is a bit of a factor to consider with agricultural buildings, is often it's very hard to get the max throughput in the building because you want to build it to 51, and most places don't have enough arable land to allow this. States like Delhi do, and so you can very easily push the cotton up to 51, the silk up to 51, the dyes up to 51, and then have dirt cheap inputs for your textile mills that will be ridiculously profitable, even though they're selling to other places in your market. If you happen to be playing the East India Company or take some of their states, or have some states, that have some of these features, like for example in Qing, Guangdong has at least dyes and silk. I don't think there's one in China that has dyes, silk, and fabric. I think you will see it all in North Bengal as well. This will be reasonable. Also, additionally, Delhi in particular is very, very, very strong because they have wheat farms. And if I'm not mistaken, they have subsistence farms instead of subsistence rice farms, which means when you build one, you only cause 5k people to get fired from the sub farms instead of a rice farm, which will cause 10k people to get fired. So subsistence rice paddies, every time one of those is built over. And so really Delhi is probably the best place for this. But you should keep kind of in mind that if you are having a place where you're auto-expanding cotton or auto-expanding dyes, and that place is incorporated, this is probably a good place to put down an auto-expand on the textile mills. Further, textile mills do have an input of tools, and tools are going to be a pretty flexible one, and so tools here also wouldn't be terrible. If you have a place, in South America, let's say, that is going to have dyes and rubber, then tools will be even better because tools use rubber as an input, and so this will be something to keep in mind as well. Next up is a little bit of a distinction on coastal provinces, which is that you are going to sometimes in these places want to build shipyards and military shipyards, and so I think it is going to be that you want to build less or be less likely to want to auto-expand furniture specifically, because you're going to be using wood on the shipyards for most of the game until you get to the later PMs, at which point, it will be fine to expand the furniture. But also important is going to be fish. Fish is really, really good to build for the purposes of depeasanting. It's also very, very, very worker efficient. You won't be able to build them too tall. There's not a lot of fish in the game, so it's like meh. But this is an important input for your food industries. And so because this is where you're creating the demand for food industries is generally not very good as an industry. If you're going to put an auto-expanding food industry somewhere, putting it on the coast where you have fish makes a lot of sense. A secondary point of this is that it is also going to make a lot of sense in places where you are building a lot of soldiers, which we'll talk about next. It's also going to be reasonable to put in, and also just generally where you have a lot of excess labor, because one of the reasons why food industries are not very good is because they take a lot of extra employment. If you're in a place that doesn't have a lot of stuff going on for it, then building a food industry there, if you have a lot of unemployment, will help to employ a lot of the pops up. But having a sensitivity towards the shipyards and the fact that you have fish there is something to consider for coastal provinces. Also noting, consumer goods will be generally good in the ones that get trade centers, because these will attract a lot of migrants. And so if you have a trade center, which happens a lot more in coastal provinces, you are going to be more wanting to put in auto-expands on the consumer goods in general. Finally, in terms of types of places, we are going to talk about the relatively barren type provinces. For this one, we have selected Toledo, which you notice the only resources we have here are the 6 logging camps. However, we have a lot of people here, and so the question is how do we make good use of this land? Well, textile mills specifically, very often you're going to have a hard time finding a really good state that produces dyes, silk, and fabric, and can build to economies scale in all of these. So generally you're going to be having to ship these somewhere else anyways, and so these are the best states to have auto-expanding textile mills. Additionally, if you have nothing else going on for you and you want to employ up the pops, often the military can be really great, and so this will be where you want to put your military military inputs, including not just, you know, the cannons, the small arms, to a lesser extent the ammunition. The ammunition also plays well in sulfur states and states with lead, but this will also include consumer goods in the form of radios, which are going to have inputs that are quite diverse, you know, and can be very often difficult to source from all the same thing. And the iron and lead will also be going into buildings that are really, really good for those things anyways. And so electronics industries will also play nice because they are providing the radios. Same with the food industries, providing the groceries to your armed forces that are going to be present there. Would really recommend building the armies out of these types of states and then building consumer goods. Furniture manufacturers will play pretty well as well in these areas, and generally any consumer good will kind of play well. You'll specifically kind of want to avoid doing stuff that requires too much resources. So like you'd want to avoid glassworks and steel, in my opinion, unless the population of these places is insanely high, and instead focus on the goods that you are likely to ship anyways, like textile mills, because these are really, it's really hard to find a place where you can build textile mills extremely well. And so these are going to be the more barren states. I suppose for a little bit of clarification, if you are having states that you are not going to incorporate that have a bunch of resources, you just put all the resources on auto-expand, and you don't auto-expand any of the manufacturing, especially if you're on colonial exploitation. But you really don't want to be paying the mappy multiple times. So for example, if we were to build something like engines here, this would be bad to put on auto-expand because, okay, it is an output that is used in the rubber as well as, you know, the cotton plantations. But the problem is that we will be getting our steel from somewhere else, and so we'll have to pay the mapping penalty, and then we will be selling our engines to somewhere else, and so we will have to buy higher at a higher price and sell lower as a result. And this is exacerbated when we have a local price that in particular is going to be worse for us because of this minus 10% modifier from unincorporated state. So this is going to be especially true with steel and engines, or anything that is a little bit more sensitive to price, that has a high price sensitivity. The stuff that has really low price sensitivity is agricultural stuff and resources, and so in these states you're just going to want to generally be blasting those things. All right, the first ones we are going to talk through on a kind of per industry basis is going to be agriculture, because there's going to be two strategies that are going to be important for agriculture. The first is agriculture is going to be best built in states that are relatively barren, or even better in unincorporated states that don't have a lot of resources or are unincorporated. A big part of why this is because whenever you build agriculture, you actually dilute a positive modifier, which is the unused arable land modifier that you have in states, which promotes migration. If we come here, we can see that there's unused arable land giving plus 7.6. You would prefer not to get rid of this modifier in states with really good mappy and have a lot of resources, and so if you're going to get rid of it somewhere, you'd prefer to do it in relatively barren states, or, as I mentioned, the unincorporated states. And so this is going to be thing one in terms of where you want to build them. The second thing is that when you are building, you are going to probably want to auto-expand exactly one thing. And the reason for this is throughput, because most states are not going to have, you know, enough to get to max throughput at all, let alone get into max throughput on multiple things. So as we come into Patsala, we see, hey, there's a lot of resources there, maybe not a good place to auto-expand. If we come into some places like La Paz, we'll see, hey, there's a decent amount of resources there, but a decent amount of arable land, and we can keep coming around until we find a state that does not have a lot of resources, and is going to serve as a better example for us here, except that all the states have a ton of resources. So Congo Oriental might be a little bit better. It has coal. We want to have that at auto-expanding. But for here, what we would want to do, and you often do this in kind of the Africa states, is we pick one of these things that's going to be really profitable, and then we put it on auto-expand. And what this also helps to do is it helps to prevent the dyes from being too profitable in other areas of our country. If Congo Oriental is constantly auto-expanding, then this is going to make it such that the dyes aren't going to be super expensive elsewhere, where we're maybe wanting to keep the, you know, modifier for unused arable land like Ica. Maybe we're trying to pull pops here. It's incorporated, it has iron and sulfur, and we're trying to, you know, get a little bit done with the explosives and well, we should have fertilizer here, but the etc. and the mostly etc. And so pulling them to Congo Oriental, pulling down the price of dyes so it's less likely to auto-expand through the private queue is going to be useful, although we're not using the private queue in this run. But this is going to be helpful, and so you're going to want to build them in exactly one place. So those are the two background sort of considerations here. Going through each industry, the livestock you are only ever going to want to auto-expand. It's not a very good industry in places like Namakland, which the particular reason why is you only have livestock to expand. And so there's a sort of hierarchy of these goods in terms of which ones are best, the very best being opium, such that if you have the best thing to build there, that's what you put on auto-expand. So let's kind of go through them one at a time. We're not going to rank the hierarchy in its entirety. I guess we can say that kind of the premium is opium. Also not in here, but is kind of in the same sphere, is going to be rubber. Well, rubber doesn't use arable land. Cotton plantations are going to be good because they have the additional throughput from the tech relative to the PM. Dyes and silk are decent, and then also rice and rye are also going to be pretty good. We can't even build any rye farms, which is tragic, but we'll talk through each of the grains. Next up are the grains. In particular, the two ones that are good are going to be rice, because rice is disgustingly construction efficient. Rice is going to be particularly good if you have a lot of peasants or unemployed pops. Other than that, it will be kind of okay. The next one is going to be rye, which is really good for pulling up your standard of living. Rye having an output that allows you to do potato farms, which allows you to collapse the price of liquor, which is going to affect your lower rung pops much better. These are decent kind of at any point in the game to put an auto expand on, but after that we have all of the plantations after the grains, which you're only going to ever really want to put on auto expand, and often you do put it on auto expand after you research pump jacks, which basically doubles the efficacy of their PM. You don't really auto-expand before that, but after that, vineyards will kind of be okay if there's nothing else going on. If the only other option is a grain that's kind of inferior, vineyards will be good. Banana plantations, I think you never do. You never put on auto-expand in particular. I guess if you just found a banana plantation in one spot that was just super highly built, you would do it, but you kind of prefer your pops to consume goods other than the fruit. But maybe there's an argument to building it in one place so it's less likely to be built in another, and you just get the throughput. Coffee plantations, you're going to be kind of looking around asking yourself, hey, is there nothing better? It's going to be generally when you have not very good options in the stuff that leads into clothes, or a superior grain like rice or rye. That's when you kind of build the coffee. Cotton and dyes and silk in particular are going to look good. One of the problems with silk in a lot of countries that can produce it, in the East, is you're building over sub-rice farms, and so ones where you're not building over the subsistence rice farms are going to look a little bit better. On the kind of other hand, in regards to silk, importing it from Qing is really good. Qing gets a special modifier, their own unique tech, which will be in the top left corner of production, which gives them extra throughput on it, and so just letting them build it can also be a decent strategy as well, and not importing it, but that will leave you kind of going after dye and cotton. I think any place that can build opium, you put it on auto expand, regardless of what phase you are in the game. You kind of want to lock in the opium in those places. Sugar, I think that you prefer to get the good of sugar from rice farms or other farms, because a lower grain price is good for SOL. So I don't too often put auto expands on sugar, but there are going to be some states, especially in South America, where that's going to be kind of the best good you can do, because you can't do cotton or dyes. I think there's a few states, kind of in this region where you can't do cotton or dyes, and you can do sugar or something like this, and sometimes it can be good to throw one in every once in a while. Tea and tobacco, if the price or productivity of it is looking really spectacular, it can be good to throw in a couple in states where you have all this unused arable land. You just throw one in and you put it on auto expand if the pricing is good for this sort of thing. And that's how we think about the agriculture. Very, very, very important. If we are building tea here, we would want to only be auto expanding tea. Just the tea, because the throughput is going to be really, really strong, and the auto queue, the private queue, can't appreciate this sort of thing when it comes to the throughput. It can't think way, way, way far into the future and understand that we want the agricultural buildings to be built up to level 60 and have nothing else there. And so as a result, having auto expands will help your economy reach this sort of thing. And I think it's generally very good to put them in after pump jacks, at least one on each good where you can build in regards to the plantations, and then start to sprinkle them in more, as time goes by and you acquire more states with which to do this. Okay, next up we have the resources. Now, it's important to emphasize that when you put stuff on auto-expand, it's not necessarily going to be optimal, but I think putting all of the resources on auto-expand is going to be solid enough. You, in theory, would want to be pushing throughput and economies of scale where you already have your construction more, and in this sense, not have on automatic expand, but it's never going to be bad, and unlike the agriculture, you don't build over your potentials for other things elsewhere. But there are two industries that really stand out, and that is the logging camp and the fishing wharves and the whaling stations, which I just conceptually lump in with the fishing wharves. And the reason why these are so spectacular is because they only cost 200 construction. You see this? 200, 200, 200. And unlike the rubber plantations, they are owned by capitalists. Now, the rubber plantations are fantastic because the PMs are really good and this is okay and you want to auto-expand them anyways. But I think that something you can do in the early game, especially because fishing wharves help to raise your SOL, is you can go for logging camps because they are going to be so efficient at getting rid of peasants or de-peasanting pops that you can kind of just like cruise in, and any place that has any amount of peasants that is substantive, especially unincorporated territories, you will want to just, blast the logging as much as possible. Just come in and just be like, hey, there are peasants here. We got to get rid of them. And so we're going to do this for that, as well as for the fish. You can see already expanded almost all the fish here. There's not too many places with no peasants left. And then we could just come in and we can put them all on auto expand. Really, really, really key, though, with the logging and the fish, that this is really strong. And that you can kind of auto-expand the resources really aggressively in general, and it will be fine. If we're talking playing optimally, you would actually want to, build targeting in places where you have construction, especially with the iron and coal, but this is going to be a fine enough or good enough way of going about things. And then what you can do is you can come in and you can, push throughput in areas where hey, this is Wallonia, great state, probably have a lot of construction there. We can think to push it up, but this is active play, and the reason to not do it is we don't have any peasants there. So the resources auto-expand anywhere that you have them is fine enough, but you want to aggressively put in auto-expands on both the fishing wharves and the logging camps, kind of in any phase of the game where you have peasants in the place. If you have no peasants, don't worry about it. They're not going to be that great there, but if you do have peasants, they're going to be real good. Finally, we have the industries. Big nice. And these have the most complex strategy involved where you want to auto-expand them, but it's generally kind of looking at their inputs and saying, hey, we want to put them either a place where we are generating their inputs or where they are being consumed. This is going to be how we look at it, and we've already talked about them quite a bit, so we'll try and kind of get through these a little bit quickly. Arms industry and artillery, and to a lesser extent munitions, and also very, very much so on the war industries, which I don't think we have one of these industries yet. You're going to prefer to build these in places where you have a lot of your soldiers, which tends to be more barren types of states, because it's hard to find jobs for these guys. And in doing this, you do not want to build them in places where you have a lot of industry. So, for example, Navarra, even though on Navarra, we have a reasonable, inputs coming in here. We have steel, we have the tools, we have the coal. We won't really have that many input, or we won't have that much demand in Navarra because we're not really building troops there, because we have so much opportunity for industry there. And so we would prefer to put arms industries in a place like Toledo, where, just putting this on auto-expand is fine. It won't necessarily employ up. Very often you have a huge glut of these things, but it'll give some jobs, and so this will be useful because there's other and better jobs in, the states with good sorts of mapping. And so artillery and arms industries are going to in particular be good in these barren types of states. Food industries also good in barren states. You're less concerned with the inputs, but they are also going to be slightly better on the coast, so we'll generally want to build them on the coast, and they're also going to be better where you're building grain, which also happens to often be more barren-ish states where you're building grain, because they have an input of both sugar and grain. A lot of grains output sugar, and so if you have a state, in China where you're auto-expanding rice, the food industries will be decent because the rice farms, when you are on this, output several things that feed into the food industry. Next up is furniture, which is going to be reasonably good any place where you have wood in particular, and they're going to be really good any place where you have a ton of pops. Generally speaking, it is fine to put an auto expand where you have pops. In terms of the inputs, they are inputting mostly wood, but also a little bit of fabric and a little bit of coal. It's important to emphasize, I guess, with the coal, which we didn't talk about too much, is coal feeds into a ton of different things, and so building anything will be mostly okay where you have coal. It might not be spectacular, but if you are finding a hard place to put something, and you have places that already have a lot of buildings going on, and you don't want to add there, and you have a place that has coal that doesn't have much else, often coal places will be decent for anything else. That's important to mention, and so that would be decent for the furniture, but the furniture is going to go where you're like not auto expanding a whole bunch of other stuff. Glassworks you're going to want to put them wherever you have lead. To a lesser extent, you could put them where you have oil or dyes, but they are going to really perform quite well where you have lead, because they are one of the biggest draws on your lead, and also because they're one of the biggest draws on your lead, and also lead is one of the bigger inputs for them, especially before you get onto the oil PMs. This is going to be increasingly true if you are in places where you have a lot of lead. Let's find one of those places for us here. You will actually even want to consider, so let's see, here we have 33 lead in Zambia. You will even want to consider, let's go there. You will even want to consider, well, this isn't incorporated, so we don't want to do this, but you would even want to consider doing a glassworks, building it super tall, and then putting it on prioritized glass production so it can provide glass to the rest of your country. And so that's going to be the glassworks. Paper mills, as we discussed earlier, are going to really shine in areas that have sulfur. To a lesser extent, they're also going to be fine in the capital because you'll generally have the highest demand for paper in the capital. We'll get to that. Textile mills are going to be really great in barren states, or there are going to be a few states that are just spectacular for them. But because they have 3 inputs that are all agrarian, and it's really hard to get economies of scale on each of those, and you're going to have to generally import goods for it anyways, the textile mills are very good in places where you don't have anything else to build, really, and so they're going to really perform well there. Tools go into a lot of stuff, and so as a result, they are going to be pretty good everywhere. They're also, the PM is really efficient. You can really tolerate shipping your tools around, and so very often you will be exporting a lot of tools. You will often want to use a tooling company as part of a macro strategy. If you're using a company, building that industry anywhere is going to be a little bit better. But if you are building a lot of tools and you're exporting tools, then the fact that you are going to have the negative effect of mapping somewhere if you're exporting something. And very often you can end up exporting a lot of tools if you're using a tooling company, which is very often a good strategy. As a result, tools are a great thing to place anywhere, just like textiles. Electronics industries, I think, generally are best where you have a lot of population, in particular areas that are relatively barren. So instead of looking for the input goods as aggressively, although they will be a little bit better where you have iron and lead, I think it's good to build them in high population areas, and areas in particular where you are going to have high demand for telephones, which is the high pop areas, but also high demand for radios, which is going to be the relatively barren states where you place your militaries in. Next up is explosives, which you can see the inputs are going to be all from the sulfur chain, and so you're going to want to build them out really aggressively in the sulfur chain, and to a lesser extent in areas where you are going to be having construction, because it is an input for construction, and also in areas where you have construction, you are going to have a lot of mines. You're going to have lead and coal, and so this will create a lot of demand for the explosives, and so they will be decent there. Fertilizer, you're going to want to place in places where you have sulfur specifically. There's a lot of other places that place a demand on your iron, so you are going to want to build them more around sulfur than around iron. You're generally going to want to build more construction and steel around the iron, which leaves you, with the wanting for things to stimulate sulfur, and so generally you want to put the fertilizer there. Fertilizer, if you only have a couple states that you want to build agriculture in, building fertilizer there will also be good. And by agriculture, I mean grains specifically. Shipyards are going to be good where you have the ships, where you're building the ships of either kind. This is generally going to be the case. And in particular with the shipyards, there are a few states. Let's find one of them. I don't think we have one. Rip the dream for us in Iberia. But there are going to be a few states in particular with this modifier, which is the docklands or some type of shipyards building throughput modifier. If you have a state with one of these, you want to be auto-expanding the shipyards in that state, because you will very rarely actually hit 51 shipyards in a game. If we come in here, we're relatively late game, 1 billion GDP, slightly over, and we have 12 military shipyards and 75 regular shipyards. So, it would be great if we just had one level 51 in a state, for example, that has one of these bonuses, and they could just feed it to the other guys. Okay, so that is the shipyards. Motor industries, generally we are going to prefer to build this in places we have steel. And so this is going to mean places with iron and coal. The reason for this is that very often, it's going to be okay in low levels elsewhere, and it won't be terrible, but we don't necessarily really want to push it too aggressively. You do not want to build this in unincorporated areas, though, where you have a demand for both railways as well as from agriculture, like the dyes plantations and the rail needing for pump jacks, the pump jacks PM, that is. Munition plants we already talked about. Steel, you're going to want it specifically, in my opinion, where you have, there's two heuristics. It's going to be in states like Navarra, where you have the iron and the coal, with the iron being way more important. This is important to emphasize. You use way more iron in than you do coal in the steel PMs. So the iron's way more important. If you have just iron, that's probably fine. If you have just coal, much less fine for building the steel. But also, it's a decent shout if you have just an enormous population somewhere and you have to build there. It's a decent shout to end up building the steel there and putting it on auto-expand. An example might be if you are playing the Sikh Empire and you have Punjab, which just has an enormous population, and you have a ton of peasants there, then you can maybe want to build it there. And then we have synthetics plants, mainly going to want to go in where you have sulfur and have these on auto-expand and specifically stimulate demand for the sulfur. Sulfur is the best industry in the game, and so this allows you to build a little bit more sulfur. There's maybe a world where you want to just kind of, everything that sulfur goes into, maybe just export all of those things just so you can build more sulfur if you have a ton of sulfur potentials you're not utilizing. And finally, we have the arts academies, which I think is actually one of the more interesting ones for auto-expansion, because you might not be able to see the employment. You can see the employment. You might notice there's actually a heckin' lot of academics employed in the Arts Academy. As a result, I think that the Arts Academy is a really, really good industry to place in your capital, because your capital has a special modifier in terms of universal pop political strength. And so, in particular, when you put, if you want the Arts Academies to build in one place, because you want them to build tall, and you don't want them to be building elsewhere, the best place is actually the capital, because you would love there to be more academics at the capital very often, because you're trying to increase the power of the Intelligentsia. And so, I think the one place you expand arts academies, even though they suck, is in the capital, and you do this because this will make it so that the private queue will want to build them less in other places, and you get to put them in the capital specifically. The capital will tend to have higher population anyways, and in this way, you will get the academics, pulling up the SOL, or not the SOL, the clout of the Intelligentsia, trying to keep it above that 20% for what is becoming increasingly important in 1.6, I think, this migration attraction modifier.